I woke up to the sound of nothing. No gentle splashing, no faint gurgle of the filter, no shimmering blue reflections dancing on my bedroom ceiling, just eerie silence. Confused, I threw on some slippers and rushed outside, only to be greeted by a sight so absurd I momentarily thought I was still dreaming. My pool, my massive, meticulously maintained, expensive backyard pool, was empty, not a drop of water. The once inviting, crystal-clear oasis now looked like a barren crater in the middle of my yard. Then I saw them. A group of HOA members stood at the edge of my property, arms folded smugly. Leading them was Victoria Harrington, the neighborhood's self-appointed queen of unnecessary rules and insufferable micromanagement. She stood there with her clipboard, an unmistakable smirk plastered across her face. "Good morning, Marcus," she called out, voice dripping with faux politeness. "I see you've noticed our little adjustment." My brain struggled to process the sheer insanity of what I was witnessing. "Adjustment," I echoed. Victoria let out a dramatic sigh as if I were the unreasonable one. "The HOA board voted unanimously to drain it. We sent you a notice 2 weeks ago." She gestured toward my mailbox where a bright yellow envelope stuck out like a warning flare. I snatched it up and ripped it open. HOA violation 237B, unauthorized water waste, effective immediately, fine $2,500. I let out a hollow laugh, scanning the letter like it might suddenly make sense if I read it again. You actually drained my pool without my permission." Victoria's smirk widened. "It's not about permission, Marcus, it's about responsibility. We're in a drought." I stared at her in disbelief. "Drought? The city hasn't declared one." "Well," she sniffed, "the HOA has. We must set an example." Behind Victoria, I noticed a man I hadn't seen before, watching the confrontation with keen interest. He wore a sharp suit that seemed out of place for a Saturday morning, and he was taking notes on a small pad. His presence seemed to embolden Victoria even further. "Who's your friend?" I asked, nodding toward him. Victoria's smile grew even smugger, if that was possible. "This is James Westfield from the Westfield Development Group. He's assessing our community's sustainability practices." James gave me a curt nod but remained silent, his eyes calculating. I blinked in confusion. "An example?" I gestured wildly toward the perfectly green HOA-mandated golf course a few streets over, its sprinklers still blissfully spraying water into the air. "What about that? Or the ridiculous fountain at the community center? Or, oh, I don't know, the fact that I pay for my own damn water?" Victoria gave a fake, patronizing chuckle. "Oh, Marcus, homeowners don't always understand what's best for the community. That's why the HOA exists, to make difficult decisions on your behalf." Just then, my neighbor Sofia Rodriguez appeared, carrying a stack of legal books. She'd moved in next door 6 months ago, but we'd rarely spoken beyond casual greetings. Today, however, her timing couldn't have been better. "What's happening here?" she asked, eyeing the empty pool and then Victoria's smug expression. I noticed Victoria's smile falter slightly at Sofia's appearance. "The HOA drained my pool without permission," I explained. Sophia's eyebrows shot up. "They did what?" She turned to Victoria. "On what legal grounds?" Victoria's eyes narrowed. "This doesn't concern you, Ms. Rodriguez." "Actually," Sophia replied coolly, "as a water rights attorney, I'd say it very much does, especially since Marcus and I were just discussing his unique position in this community yesterday." I had no idea what she was talking about, but I wasn't about to contradict her, especially when I saw the flicker of uncertainty cross Victoria's face. I took a slow, measured breath, willing myself not to say something that would put me in legal trouble. "You drained my pool," I said, voice dangerously low, "for wasting water even though I paid for it, in a neighborhood that uses more water on decorative plants than an entire city block." "That's correct." I ran a hand through my hair, trying to contain the sheer rage bubbling up inside me. "And if I refuse to pay this fine?" Victoria's eyes practically sparkled with anticipation. "Then we put a lien on your house, of course." I clenched my jaw so hard I thought my teeth might crack. This was the kind of ridiculous, overreaching HOA nonsense I had heard about in horror stories. But draining an entire pool, that wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an outright power play. Sophia stepped closer, placing a calming hand on my arm. "Victoria," she said, her tone professional but with an edge of steel, "before you proceed with any liens, you might want to check the county water rights registry. Marcus here has an interesting legal position." Victoria's confidence wavered visibly. "What are you talking about?" I took a step closer, locking eyes with Victoria. You know, Victoria, I said slowly, voice deceptively calm, I don't think you realize who you're messing with. Victoria scoffed, clearly unbothered. Oh, Marcus, don't be dramatic, rules are rules. A laugh bubbled up in my throat. It wasn't amused, it was the kind of laugh that came from knowing something no one else did. The kind of laugh that sent a warning to whoever heard it, because, oh, Victoria had no idea. I took a deep breath, feeling the first flickers of satisfaction creep in despite my anger. Let me ask you something, Victoria. Where do you think the water in this neighborhood comes from? Her smug expression faltered slightly. The city, obviously. I smiled. It was not a friendly smile. Wrong. Her frown deepened. What? James Westfield suddenly seemed much more interested in our conversation, stepping closer to hear better. I crossed my arms, letting the moment sink in. You see, Victoria, 20 years ago, when this neighborhood was being developed, the original landowners didn't sell the water rights to the city. They sold them to a private investor. Victoria's eyebrows knitted together. What does that have to do with anything? I tilted my head slightly. That investor was me. Silence, beautiful, weighty silence. I could practically hear the gears turning in Victoria's head. She blinked twice, then laughed, a forced, brittle sound. That's ridiculous. I shrugged. Is it? Her fingers gripped her clipboard a little tighter. You're lying. Am I? James Westfield was now frantically typing something into his phone, his face a mask of concentration. For the first time since I'd met her, Victoria actually looked uncertain. I could see it, the way her confidence wavered for just a second, the way her shoulders stiffened. She didn't know, because of course HOA presidents never actually read the fine print. Sophia smiled faintly. The Reed Water Trust, she said. Established in 2001 during the initial development phase. I looked it up when we met at the community mixer last month. Quite impressive, Marcus. I decided to twist the knife just a little deeper. You know that emergency water conservation fee you're about to impose on homeowners? I asked casually. It would be a shame if there wasn't any water to conserve. Victoria's face paled. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice to a near whisper. You just picked a fight with a man who controls every drop of water in this neighborhood. She took a half step back, clearly trying to regain control. You can't just turn off the water. I smiled again. Can I? Her mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. He absolutely can, Sophia confirmed, her professional demeanor giving way to obvious enjoyment of Victoria's discomfort. And legally, there's nothing the HOA can do about it. James Westfield stepped forward, his business card suddenly extended toward me. Mr. Reed, perhaps we could speak privately. Westfield Development has some interests that might align with yours. I ignored him, keeping my focus on Victoria. I clapped a hand on her shoulder in mock sympathy. Oh, Victoria, you really should have read the contract. And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, silent, shaken, and for the first time in her life, completely powerless. Because tomorrow, this entire neighborhood was going to learn what it really meant to be at the mercy of the HOA rules. And Victoria, she was about to learn what it meant to be at the mercy of me. Marcus, wait, Sophia called, jogging to catch up with me. When we were out of earshot, she whispered, do you actually own the water rights? I hesitated. Truth was, I'd purchased this house 6 months ago without diving too deeply into the property history. But Victoria didn't need to know that. Let's talk inside, I murmured. Once in my kitchen, Sophia's professional composure gave way to excitement. You don't own the water rights, do you? That was brilliant bluffing. I ran a hand through my hair. Not exactly bluffing. My grandfather mentioned something about water rights when he helped me buy this place. Said the previous owner had left some paperwork that might be valuable someday. I've got a box of documents in the attic I never bothered to sort through. Sophia's eyes widened. We need to find those papers now. The next morning, I sat on my porch with a fresh cup of coffee, watching the neighborhood slowly wake up. It was the perfect, peaceful scene, birds chirping, joggers making their morning rounds, sprinklers kicking on in synchronized bursts. The HOA's prized golf course, which had somehow evaded their so-called drought restrictions, was lush and green under the golden sunlight. It was almost a shame that all of this was about to change. Almost. Beside me, Sophia sat reviewing the documents we'd found in my attic. The papers confirmed what I'd suspected. My property included a partial ownership of the original water rights. Not total control as I'd implied to Victoria, but enough to cause significant disruption if I chose to exercise it. This is fascinating, Sophia murmured. The original developer created a trust with distributed ownership, but the controlling interest was attached to your property. Legally, you could restrict water flow to communal areas while maintaining residential service. Meaning I could target just the HOA's precious amenities, I asked, a plan forming in my mind. Precisely, she smiled, a glint of mischief in her eyes, and I'd be happy to provide legal counsel. Victoria drove me out of my previous neighborhood with her ridiculous rules when she was on that HOA board. This is personal. I took one last sip of coffee, pulled out my phone, and made a single call to the water management company listed in the documents. It took less than 5 minutes for the chaos to begin. The first sign was the sputtering of sprinklers. At first, people didn't think much of it, a slight drop in pressure, maybe a minor plumbing issue. Then it got worse. Hoses that had been left running slowed to a trickle before stopping entirely. A woman watering her garden stared in disbelief as nothing but air wheezed out of her nozzle. And then came the yelling. Victoria had no idea what was happening yet, but I saw her storm out of her house in a bathrobe, phone pressed to her ear as she stomped toward the HOA office. Other board members quickly joined, looking equally confused. I watched from my porch, sipping my coffee, as Victoria's usually smug expression twisted into one of pure frustration. Then came the real panic. Residents began knocking on each other's doors, murmuring about the sudden outage. A man in gym clothes tried his kitchen faucet and swore loudly when nothing came out. A woman with a half-full bathtub stared at it like it was her last supply of fresh water on Earth. Then the HOA's beloved golf course sprinklers cut off mid-cycle, leaving the greens dry and vulnerable under the scorching sun. The decorative fountain in front of the community center gurgled for a few seconds before collapsing into stillness. Victoria's voice, usually a condescending purr, turned into a shrill bark. She was barking orders at her fellow board members, but they all looked helpless. She waved her phone in the air as if she could threaten the water back into existence. I knew exactly what she was doing, calling the city. She would be in for quite the surprise. I stood up and stretched before casually walking down the street toward the HOA office, pretending to be just another confused homeowner. The crowd had gathered outside, people demanding answers from Victoria, who looked like she was moments away from a full-blown meltdown. "Everyone, please remain calm," she said, though her voice was anything but. "We're working on identifying the issue and we'll have water restored as soon as possible." A few homeowners looked skeptical, arms crossed. One woman in a bathrobe raised an eyebrow. "So it's an issue now? I thought the HOA was all about conserving water." Victoria's eye twitched, but she forced a smile. "Yes, and conservation is important, but this is an unexpected infrastructure failure." To my surprise, I noticed James Westfield at the edge of the crowd, observing the situation with keen interest. His presence made me uneasy. Why was a developer so interested in our neighborhood water crisis? I almost felt bad for Victoria, almost. Victoria spotted me in the crowd and her face twisted into something between suspicion and barely contained rage. "Marcus," she said, voice tight, "do you know anything about this?" I took a moment to savor the moment, then gave a casual shrug. "Me? Oh, I don't know, Victoria. I thought the HOA was supposed to handle all our water needs. Isn't that why you drained my pool, to teach us about responsibility?" The murmur in the crowd grew louder. People were starting to connect the dots. Victoria's own logic was coming back to bite her. Victoria's patience was thinning. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" she snapped. I tilted my head. "You think I'm enjoying the fact that my neighbors don't have running water?" "No, Victoria, that sounds awful. But I will say it's fascinating how quickly the HOA is panicking now that you don't have total control over the situation." She glared at me, then turned to one of the board members. "Get the city on the phone, now." The man nodded and made a call, his expression shifting rapidly from hopeful to pale. He lowered the phone, looking at Victoria with barely disguised fear. "The city says they don't control our water." Victoria's jaw clenched. "That's ridiculous, of course they do." Sophia stepped forward, legal documents in hand. "Actually, Victoria, they don't. And before you accuse Marcus of causing this, you should know that we've already filed an emergency petition with the Water Management District to restore residential service. It's only the community amenities, like your precious golf course, that will remain dry." I smiled. "No, Victoria, they don't." The crowd went silent. The realization hit her like a truck. I let the moment hang in the air before stepping forward, hands in my pockets. "You see, years ago when this neighborhood was developed, the city never actually purchased the water rights. They assumed they would have access when the time came, but the developers had a different plan. Victoria looked like she wanted to throttle me, and let me guess, that plan involved you. I gave her a slow nod. Correct, they distributed the water rights among several properties with the controlling interest attached to mine. I own enough to determine how water is allocated to communal spaces in this neighborhood. The city never bought them back, and the HOA, well, they never even realized it wasn't city-controlled to begin with. The weight of the situation began to dawn on Victoria. Which means, I continued, when you drained my pool and decided to impose ridiculous water conservation fees, you were making demands on something you had no authority over. Victoria's hands clenched into fists. You can't just turn off the water. I grinned, can I? The homeowners murmured louder, whispers of rebellion spreading. The HOA had always been overreaching, but now they were completely exposed. James Westfield pushed through the crowd toward me. Mr. Reed, as I mentioned yesterday, Westfield Development would be very interested in purchasing those water rights from you. I'm prepared to make a generous offer. The crowd fell silent, everyone's attention shifting to this unexpected development. Victoria took a shaky breath, eyes darting around as she realized she was losing control. Fine, you win, turn it back on. I clicked my tongue. Oh, Victoria, it's not that simple. You see, water distribution is a business, and given how the HOA has been running things, I'm afraid I can't offer the same courtesy pricing as before. Her face turned an alarming shade of red. You're holding the neighborhood hostage. Actually, Sophia interjected, legally speaking, he's merely exercising his property rights, something the HOA claims to respect. She turned to the crowd. As Marcus's legal representative, I can assure you all that residential water will be restored by this afternoon. We're simply renegotiating the terms for communal spaces. I raised an eyebrow. No, Victoria, I'm simply giving the homeowners a choice. They can either continue paying outrageous HOA fees for nothing, or they can purchase water directly from me at fair, reasonable rates. It was a masterpiece. The HOA had spent years milking the homeowners dry with fees and rules. Now they were powerless. Victoria knew it. I could see the defeat creeping into her expression. Then one of the residents, an older man who had been at the HOA's mercy for years, spoke up. You know what? I'm sick of the HOA. I'll buy my water from Marcus. Another voice chimed in. Same here. Then another and another. But not everyone was on board. A woman in an expensive tracksuit stepped forward. This is outrageous. You can't just hijack our community's resources. The HOA keeps our property values high. Several others nodded in agreement, and suddenly the crowd was divided. Those fed up with Victoria's tyranny versus those who believed the HOA was necessary for maintaining their exclusive community. James Westfield seized the moment. Ladies and gentlemen, please, there's a simple solution here. Westfield Development can take over the water management for the entire community. We have the resources to ensure fair distribution and reasonable pricing. Victoria's eyes widened in horror as she watched her power slip away. This wasn't just about the water anymore. This was the beginning of the end for the HOA. But then she smiled, a cold, calculating smile that made my stomach drop. Actually, she said, her composure suddenly returning, I think we should all hear what Mr. Westfield has to say. After all, his company has already purchased the adjacent land for a new development. Perhaps it's time our community considered expansion options. James Westfield nodded appreciatively. Indeed, Mrs. Harrington. In fact, we've been in talks with the HOA board for some time about a potential merger of our developments. I exchanged a glance with Sophia, whose expression had turned serious. Marcus, this is a calculated move. They're trying to outmaneuver you. Victoria looked like she was about to explode, her face turning redder by the second, her hands shaking as she tried to maintain her usual composed demeanor. But there was no coming back from this. The crowd around her was already shifting. The same homeowners who once feared her power were now standing taller, looking at her with something between amusement and contempt. They had spent years trapped under the HOA's absurd rules, and now they had an out, an alternative that didn't involve paying Victoria's ridiculous fines or obeying her every command. She took a deep breath, straightened her clipboard like it was some kind of lifeline, and turned to the board members behind her. We're not finished here, she hissed under her breath before storming back into the HOA office. The other board members hesitated before following her inside, exchanging nervous glances. I didn't bother chasing her down. There was no need. The damage was already done, and I knew exactly what her next move was going to be. Victoria wasn't the type to admit defeat, even when she had already lost. No, she would double down, fight back, and in doing so, she would dig herself into an even deeper hole. As the crowd dispersed, James Westfield approached me again. "Mr. Reed, my offer still stands, and I should mention water rights can be complicated to enforce. Our legal team has considerable experience in this area." Was that a veiled threat? I kept my expression neutral. "I'll consider it." "Do that," he replied, handing me his card. "Sooner rather than later would be wise." I let the crowd disperse, nodding and shaking hands with the homeowners who had already declared their support. A few asked how soon they could switch over to my water services. I assured them that the transition would be smooth, though I made a point not to rush. The longer the HOA suffered without control, the better. Sophia pulled me aside, her expression grave. "Marcus, I've heard of Westfield Development. They're notorious for hostile takeovers of communities like this. They find leverage points like water rights and exploit them." "So Victoria might be working with them?" I asked. "Or being manipulated by them," Sophia replied. "Either way, we need to be careful. This just got a lot more complicated than draining a swimming pool." Inside the HOA office, the board members were arguing. I didn't have to eavesdrop to know what was being said. Victoria was likely barking orders, demanding they find some legal loophole to regain control. But there was none. The water rights were in my name, legally and undeniably. Even if they attempted to challenge me in court, they would lose, or so I thought. Later that afternoon, I received an email from the HOA's official account. It was a formal notice stating that the HOA would be taking emergency action to ensure water stability in the neighborhood. It sounded serious, but I knew what it really meant. Victoria was about to pull a desperate move. What I didn't expect was the knock on my door that evening. 2 sheriff's deputies stood on my porch, looking uncomfortable. "Marcus Reed," one asked.
"Yes."
"We have a temporary restraining order preventing you from interfering with the community water supply." He handed me a legal document. "You're ordered to restore full water service immediately pending a hearing." I stared at the paper in disbelief. "This is ridiculous. I have the legal rights to." "Sir, we're just serving the papers. You'll need to take it up with the judge." After they left, I called Sophia in a panic. How the hell did they get a judge to sign this so quickly? "James Westfield," she said grimly. "His company has considerable political influence, and guess who's on the county zoning board? Victoria's husband." That night, I sat on my porch, watching as a few HOA board members crept around in the dark, whispering among themselves. I didn't even have to guess what they were doing. They thought they could bypass me. Maybe they believed that if they called in a favor from someone at the city, they could override my rights. Maybe they thought they could strike some under-the-table deal. It didn't matter, because while Victoria was scrambling in the background, something else was happening that she didn't see coming. The homeowners were turning against her at an alarming speed. The next morning, another crowd formed, this time in front of the HOA office. But it wasn't a protest, it was a demand. People were furious, not just about the situation, but about everything. The unnecessary fines, the ridiculous rules, the fact that the HOA had been sucking money out of their pockets for years without actually providing anything in return. Victoria emerged from the office looking exhausted but still defiant. She tried to calm the crowd, saying that she had assurances from the city and that water would be restored soon, but people weren't buying it anymore. And then came the revelation that changed everything. Sophia had spent the night digging through county records and discovered something explosive. "Attention, everyone," she called out, holding up a stack of documents. "I found evidence that Victoria Harrington and the HOA board have been in negotiations with Westfield Development to sell portions of our community's common areas, including the golf course and park, for commercial development." The crowd gasped. Victoria's face went white. "That's a lie," she stammered, but her eyes told a different story. James Westfield appeared from the back of the crowd, looking unperturbed. "It's simply business," he said smoothly. "Progress is inevitable. Westfield Development is offering a premium price for underutilized community land." "Underutilized?" someone shouted. "Those are our green spaces." Another homeowner stepped forward. "Is this why you've been increasing our HOA fees, to make us pay for maintaining spaces you're planning to sell?" Victoria was cornered. The board has been exploring options to maximize community value. "By selling it off to developers," an elderly man interrupted, "without consulting us." Then the votes started coming in. In every HOA, there's a clause that allows homeowners to call for a vote of no confidence in the leadership. It rarely happens because people either don't care enough or assume it won't change anything. But this time, the homeowners were fired up. They had seen the cracks in the system, and now they were ready to break it apart completely. I didn't even have to lead the charge, it happened naturally. Victoria tried to fight it. She called emergency meetings, sent out desperate emails, even tried to intimidate homeowners into keeping her in power, but it was useless. The votes were piling up, people were done with her. The court hearing about the water rights was scheduled for the following week, but it hardly mattered now. The HOA was imploding from within. James Westfield made one last attempt to salvage his plans, offering to rescue the community by taking over management of all common areas. "Your HOA is clearly in disarray," he told the gathered homeowners. "Westfield Development can provide stability and professional management." But the community had finally awakened to the manipulation. They weren't about to trade one tyrant for another. By the end of the week, it was official. The HOA was dissolved. The moment it was announced, the entire neighborhood felt lighter. Homeowners celebrated, some popping open bottles of champagne in their driveways. The golf course, once the HOA's crown jewel, was left abandoned, its sprinklers still dry. The ridiculous community center that no one used suddenly became just another building. And Victoria was the last to leave. I saw her standing outside the HOA office, staring at the now empty parking lot. The realization had finally sunk in. She had lost everything: the power, the control, even the absurdly high salary she had been collecting from HOA fees. James Westfield's company withdrew its development plans when it became clear there was no HOA to negotiate with. The community voted to convert the golf course into a natural preserve, much cheaper to maintain and accessible to everyone. Victoria spotted me watching and walked over, her steps slower than usual. For the first time in her life, she wasn't marching toward me with authority. She was just another resident now. She stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms. "You planned this," she said, her voice quieter than I expected. I took a sip of my drink. "No, Victoria, you did this to yourself." She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You think you're a hero. You think the neighborhood's going to be better off without the HOA. I shrugged. "I think people are better off when they're not being told how to live their lives by someone who only cares about power." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "What happens now?" Sophia approached, joining us on the porch. "Now the community decides for itself. We've already formed a voluntary neighborhood association. No mandatory fees, no enforcement powers, just neighbors working together." I smirked. "Now you get to find out what it's like to be just another homeowner. No special privileges, no fines to hand out, just a regular person paying for their own water like the rest of us." She gave me one last glare, but it was empty. The fight had gone out of her. Without another word, she turned and walked back to her house. A few days later, a moving truck appeared in her driveway. No one was surprised. Victoria wasn't the type to stick around after losing control. As the truck pulled away, I raised a glass from my newly refilled pool, watching as the last traces of her rule disappeared down the street. Sophia joined me, clinking her glass against mine. "To water rights," she toasted, "and community." And with that, peace finally returned to the neighborhood, not the artificial, enforced peace of HOA rule, but the genuine harmony of neighbors who had reclaimed their freedom and their homes. As for James Westfield and his development company, they moved on to easier targets. But our community had learned its lesson about the true value of controlling our own destiny, a lesson far more precious than any manicured golf course or decorative fountain could ever be.